This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web. Today's Best in Climate episode is entitled Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakate, Excoriate World Leaders for Blah, Blah, Blah Climate Failures, by Andrea Germanos, published on commondreams.org on September 28, 2021. I'm Christine, your host for this episode. Let's get started. While Uganda's Nakate said humanity cannot adapt to extinction, Thunberg from Sweden said lack of action is a betrayal of all present and future generations. Noted young climate activists Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nakate on Tuesday excoriated global leaders' response to the planetary crisis, with Thunberg calling it a betrayal of all present and future generations. Our leaders are lost, said Nakate of Uganda, and our planet is damaged. Their blunt remarks came in keynote addresses at the opening of the 3-day Youth for Climate Summit in Milan. Hundreds of young people are gathered there for in-person working groups to hash out proposals to present to ministers at the pre-COP in Milan later this month and COP26 United Nations climate talks starting next month in Glasgow. Simply focusing on adaptation measures, as Nakate put it, amounts to climate injustice. You cannot adapt to lost traditions. You cannot adapt to starvation. You cannot adapt to extinction, she said. Why is it so easy for leaders to open up new coal power plants, construct oil pipelines, and extract gas, which are all destroying our climate, Nakate said, but so hard for them to acknowledge that loss and damage is here with us now? Climate action is not a pick and choose, she continued, referencing the need to avert future impacts, but also deal with the loss and damage that is already happening. It's time for leaders to put loss and damage at the center of negotiation, said Nakate. It's time to acknowledge that there's need for additional funding on top of what has already been promised for the most vulnerable. It's time for our leaders to wake up. It's time to show us the money, she said. It's time, it's time, it's time. Sweden's Thunberg, in her remarks, rejected as meaningless global leaders' coined phrases to talk about the climate crisis. There is no planet B. There is no planet blah. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. Build back better. Blah, 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 she said. Net zero, Thunberg said. Blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders, said Thunberg. Words. Words that sound great, but so far have led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drowned in their empty words and promises. She went on to blast leaders' intentional lack of action as a betrayal of all present and future generations. Thunberg concluded her speech, leading her audience in a chant of, what do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it? Now. The summit began days after a global climate strike in which young activists in scores of countries took part in Uproot the System actions. As emissions and inequalities increase, tweeted German activist Luisa Neubauer, promoting the strike, we rise up and demand climate justice. You just listened to the post entitled Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakate, Excoriate World Leaders for Blah, Blah, Blah Climate Failures by Andrea Germanos, published on commondreams.org on September 28, 2021. Read under Creative Commons license. If you haven't already listened to both Vanessa Nakate and Greta Thunberg's speeches, I would encourage you to do so, and we will include links to those on YouTube as well as always, a link to the original article on commondreams.org. Thanks for listening. That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.